Yes, folks, I think indie titles have reached the same importance level as AAA games, at least when it comes to third-party multi-platform AAA games. And I'm not saying this as a way to, as some people might assume, to prop up the Switch's library, since there are so many excellent indie games on Switch. But I think this is speaking to the greater breadth of the audience of gamers in the world. And I'm going to throw some sales figures at you guys that show the popularity of indie games. Now, I want to caveat this with, outside of the rare exception, like when Minecraft was originally an indie title, indie games in general are not as popular overall as big AAA games. So say you have, Call of Duty go out there and sell 10, 12 million copies or whatever. You're not going to see indie games with that kind of success. But what you might see is, because there's a greater volume of indie games coming out, that a collection of indie games could equal the sales of that. Now, we know, obviously, most recently, Hollow Knight came out and hit 250,000 sales on Switch alone, but we also know that Nintendo has come out, and I'm using Nintendo's figures here because they're the easiest to track because people just keep talking about them. On Switch, we know several indie titles, according to Reggie Fils-Aimé at E3, have crossed 1 million units in sales on Switch, and that's actually more than some AAA games get, especially when you look at like the fighting genre, where games usually top out between 2 and 3 million in sales. Having an indie title reach 1 million for a fraction of the cost is extremely impressive. Now, obviously, we're just looking at pure sales figures. I think indie games overall probably collectively equal more sales than AAA games, just because there's more of them. On the highest quality ones, like your Stardew Valleys and your Celestes of the world, your Hollow Knights, Shovel Knight, and all that stuff, like all those games obviously perform phenomenally well overall. But I honestly think that AAA games, multi-platform games, aren't necessarily big system sellers like they might have used to be. There was a time when people would go out and buy, an Xbox One or a PlayStation or, an NES or something like that to play some of these games, to play Final Fantasy, to play Kingdom Hearts, to play FIFA and Madden and Call of Duty. But I think those days are mostly in the past for many consumers. Not all of them, but many, because since those games are basically available on every platform under the sun, you end up choosing your platform based on, I guess, a couple factors. One of them, at what performance level do you want to play your games at? I think that is the deciding factor for some people. That's why they would pick up an Xbox One X, and then or a gaming PC. And then, obviously, exclusives. So if you're really into Sony exclusives, you're really into Nintendo exclusives, you're really into Xbox exclusives, although those exclusives are also on PC, but you're into Xbox exclusives and you want to play them on your TV. Or if you're really into PC exclusives, like the Civilization franchise or the Total War franchise, Age of Empires, etc., etc., etc. And this is still true of most indie games, because I think indie games are also something that basically come out on everything. Not all indie games come out on everything. Some stay on Nintendo, some stay on PlayStation, stay on Xbox, stay on PC, or stay on mobile phones. But in general, people buy indie games. And I feel like indie games' importance has risen to a point where almost calling them indie games seems like an insult. And I'm not saying that because the term indie should be evil, but I feel like just like calling mobile phones, whenever I mention mobile phones as a gaming platform and everyone is so quickly dismissive of it, I think that's what happens with indie games. Whenever you talk about the importance of indie titles, I feel like a lot of people are just quickly dismissive. Oh yeah, indie titles are great, but that's not why you buy a platform. Yet, I consistently see indie games across all platforms selling phenomenally well. I see some indie games even being propped up by AAA publishers. As an example, Faye, by EA was being propped up. And like that's an indie title being propped up by a AAA company. Golf Story being propped up by Nintendo. Like, this is a regular occurrence in the industry. And I want to point out that obviously indie games have been proving a few things. One, that having, massive budgets in gaming is not everything. You don't need huge budgets to be successful. Two, gameplay does really, really matter a heck of a lot more than art direction. And three, certain art directions can make indie games look just as appealing as AAA games. And obviously we've seen, sort of that fourth category where, you know, an indie game like Hellblade, Senua's Sacrifice, proving that you can actually still make AAA style games and not have super high budgets. You just need a highly talented group of people, a small group of highly talented people. That's how they were able to pull that off. I don't think most indie developers that have never made AAA games can really do that, but I do think, you know, if you're coming from the AAA industry and then you form a small group of talented people, you can pull something off like Hellblade, and for like next to nothing compared to what that would cost to do at a bigger studio. So I feel like this is showing that the gap has been bridged, not just because of Hellblade, not just because of Shovel Knight or Hollow Knight or, you know, Celeste or the zillions of games out there. The Rampage, you know, the City Rampage game, Retro City Rampage, and like there's so many examples out there of Switch success stories that I honestly think there's more successful indie games than there is AAA games. I don't have an exact number in front of me, but I feel like this just points to the fact that we should stop dismissing the indie industry as not mattering. It's really weird because you see this a lot on the Switch side of things, where people talk about Switch is the perfect indie machine, and people treat that sort of statement as an insult to Switch, and I just don't see that argument holding a lot of weight. I think that indie games are just as important to this industry as the big budget titles, and what I don't understand is why people think that big budget titles are the only way this industry can thrive. If you look back at the early gaming days, the NES, the SNES, the PlayStation 1s, and the Genesis of the world, like there were tons of indie games back then that we just didn't call indie games because they felt like they were on par with the more expensive to make games, the movie games, the AAA games, the Marios and the Zeldas of the world, like because the budgets for those games are obviously a lot closer, and obviously there was more limitations, but still it felt like there was a spot for everyone, and I feel like that has come full circle here by 2018. The indie games have reached a point that we need to respect them on the same level that we sometimes sort of respect AAA multi-platform games. We should, there are people that get as excited for indie games as people might be excited for Anthem. There are people that get as excited for, whatever's coming next from the Celeste group that'll be just as excited for the next Zelda game. And I feel like this is something we need to put up on a pedestal, is that indie games are highly important to this industry, and indie games, in my opinion, are just as important as any other multi-platform AAA game. Now, this is going to sound a little ironic after I complained about the AAA thing, but I want all games to be on Switch, and I obviously thoroughly love the AAA industry, and well, I don't know if there's any indie game that can quite replace a Madden for me or quite replace an Assassin's Creed of sorts. I do think I could be fully satisfied with just independent games. If someone told me moving forward all I can play is indie games, I'm actually going to be okay with that. And I think you guys should be okay with that too. Thankfully, we don't live in an industry where you have to choose one or the other, right? You don't have to choose AAA games or indie games or first-party games. You have options out there that give you everything. But I just want to emphasize, as a channel here where we don't talk about indie games nearly enough, that indie games are highly important, and you've actually been watching a brand new indie game that I've been playing as of today throughout this whole video. So I hope you enjoy it. I'll put a link down to check out this game on the eShop for Nintendo Switch. And yeah, I'm Nathaniel Rovagents from Nintendo Prime, and if you like this video, you know what to do. And if you dislike the video, hit that dislike button. Subscribe for more content, and I'll catch you in the next one.
Yes.